18. Cynthia GALENS. He wasn't a good person sometimes, but nobody deserves that. Those were the words of Cynthia GALENS, a quiet woman from Farmington, New York, as she sat across from police recounting the night her boyfriend collapsed poisoned by the very drink she had prepared. Cynthia GALENS was born on February 7, 1958. A mother of two, she had endured profound loss. Her son died of a drug overdose at 19, and her personal life was marked by failed marriages and emotional strain. By 2007, she had formed a relationship with Thomas Kevin Stack, a 48-year-old Air Force veteran with a long battle against alcoholism and mental health challenges. What began as companionship between two troubled souls spiraled into something darker. Stack moved in with GALENS, and over time the relationship grew increasingly volatile. According to Cynthia, Stack was emotionally and physically abusive. Police records and court testimony later supported accounts of harassment and violence. Yet despite multiple altercations, Cynthia always took him back. On October 3, 2009, everything changed. Stack had been drinking margaritas at their home in Farmington, a quiet rural town in Ontario County. But this time, the mix was laced with something far more dangerous than tequila: antifreeze. Cynthia would later tell investigators she added a small amount, just a shot glass full, to make him sick, not to kill. She said she felt trapped, desperate, and afraid. That morning, Stack appeared unwell, but Cynthia left the house anyway. When she returned hours later, he was unresponsive, slumped in his chair. Instead of calling 911 immediately, she phoned her ex-husband. When he arrived, they debated what to do. Only at 4:30 p.m. did they finally summon emergency services. By then, it was too late. Stack died 4 days later. For months, the death was considered accidental, possibly a suicide or a tragic misjudgment by a man with a history of drinking. But in January 2010, during a visit to Florida, Cynthia confessed to an old friend. That friend contacted police. Cynthia, now back in New York, agreed to speak with investigators. Her confession led to an arrest on January 6th. She was charged with second-degree murder. At trial, prosecutors painted a picture of premeditation. The antifreeze was stored ahead of time. She had multiple opportunities to save Stack's life. Instead, she chose silence and deception. Her own daughter, Emily, testified against her, recounting how her mother asked for help in hiding the body while Stack was still alive. On September 23, 2010, a jury took just 90 minutes to find Cynthia GALENS guilty of first-degree manslaughter. On November 10th, she was sentenced to 23 years in prison. The judge noted that Cynthia had declined a plea deal that would have reduced her time behind bars, a decision that cost her dearly. Today, Cynthia GALENS remains incarcerated in New York State. Thomas Stack's family says justice was served, though the emotional toll lingers. His mother, Sandra Stack, called the year following her son's death a horrific experience. The case of Cynthia GALENS is a chilling reminder of how domestic conflict, unresolved trauma, and desperation can converge into irreversible tragedy. It wasn't a crime of passion, but of silence and of choices made in the dark. "I miss him so much, I can't stand it." Those were Cynthia's final words to detectives. But for the families left behind, missing isn't the hardest part. It's living with what's left. 19. Helen Ray FOWLER. She was a mother of 5. A boarding house owner. A woman weathered by hardship, caught in the shadow of poverty, grief, and violence. But on November 16, 1944, Helen Ray FOWLER became something else entirely, the only black woman executed by the state of New York in the 20th century. Born in 1907, Helen lived in Niagara Falls, a city with two sides: scenic wonder on the outside, and on Memorial Parkway, a reality far rougher. She was known as formidable 5'7" and over 220 pounds, raising a large family after a lifetime of loss, including the death of her infant son. In the fall of 1943, Helen's home became a tense battleground. One of her boarders, George Knight, was young, volatile, and often drunk, and on the night of October 30th, tempers boiled over. That evening, Helen entered a local tavern and found Knight drinking with another woman. A public fight erupted and spilled into the street. One witness to the scuffle was George William Fowler. No relation, a 63-year-old gas station owner from nearby Ransomville. Hours later, he followed Helen home. What happened next remains disputed to this day. According to police reports, another fight broke out inside the house. Witnesses said George Knight struck William Fowler in the head. Some claimed with a vase, others said a hammer. Fowler died on the floor of Helen's apartment. In a panic, Helen and Knight stuffed the body into a trunk, borrowed a car, and dumped it into the Niagara River under the cover of darkness. The body surfaced more than a month later. A fractured skull and signs of trauma sparked an investigation. Before long, both Helen and George Knight were arrested. Under interrogation without attorneys present, each accused the other of the killing. The trial began in February 1944, with 5 women on the jury, a first for Niagara County. The prosecution didn't prove who delivered the fatal blow. But under New York's felony murder statute, both could be held equally responsible. Helen had no defense witnesses. The verdict was Swift guilty of first-degree murder. Helen wept in court. Her sentencing to death by electrocution was nearly immediate. In the months that followed, Helen begged for clemency. She wrote a desperate letter to the lieutenant governor just hours before her execution, claiming her daughter had framed her. "Please have mercy on me," she wrote. "I'm not guilty of murder or robbery. I just helped move the man." But her appeal fell on deaf ears. On the night of November 16th, Helen Fowler was led into the death chamber at Sing Sing. Crying, but composed. She made no final statement. At 11:17 p.m., she was declared dead. George Knight followed 8 minutes later. "I want to thank you all for being so nice to me," he said before the switch was thrown. Helen's case, largely forgotten for decades, has since raised enduring questions about justice, about race, about the system's treatment of the poor and powerless. Even the prosecutor never argued that Helen struck the fatal blow, yet she died for it. Her last words, written hours before her death, "When children try to have your life taken just to be free, it's a shame." 20. Cheryl L. GASPER. In the summer of 1994, 32-year-old Air Force veteran Andy GASPER was found dead in his truck, stabbed once in the chest. The location, a quiet parking lot behind a department store in Yorkshire, New York. The killer unknown. The motive unclear. The case cold for 16 long years. But the truth would eventually surface, and when it did, it exposed betrayal, conspiracy, and a murder-for-hire plot that had been buried in silence for more than a decade. Cheryl L. GASPER, born in 1962, was a mother of 3 living in western New York. On the surface, her marriage to Andy GASPER appeared stable, but behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding. Years earlier, while Andy was stationed at Carswell Air Force Base in Texas, Cheryl began an affair with one of his fellow airmen, Randall Knight. The affair ended in 1993, but the connection between Cheryl and Knight never fully disappeared. On July 3, 1994, Cheryl made a call not to the police but to her future accomplice. She gave Knight precise instructions where her husband would be and how to find him. Knight drove across state lines from Ohio and waited for Andy in a secluded lot. There, inside the cab of his own truck, Andy GASPER was murdered. The motive, a $100,000 life insurance policy and a promise between lovers to start a new life together. But it was a dream built on deception. The insurance claim was denied after the signature on the policy was found to be forged. And just like that, the murder yielded no reward, only suspicion. Knight was arrested shortly after the killing and stood trial in 1995. Cheryl took the stand against him. But without strong evidence and with Cheryl's own story riddled with lies, Knight was acquitted. The case stalled, and for 15 years it stayed that way. Then in 2009, the cold case unit of the Cattaraugus County Sheriff's Office reopened the file. Investigators, with help from the FBI, re-examined everything: witness statements, inconsistencies, and overlooked connections. When federal agents confronted Knight again, the truth finally emerged. "I killed Andy Gasper," Knight confessed. "Cheryl told me she wanted him dead. She didn't care when or how." In exchange for a reduced sentence, Knight agreed to testify against Cheryl. On May 18, 2010, nearly 16 years after her husband's murder, Cheryl Gasper was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. In court, her voice was nearly inaudible. She admitted she conspired with Knight, guiding him step by step toward the killing. She pleaded guilty and on November 15, 2010, was sentenced to 18 years to life in prison. She offered no apology to Andy's family, only gratitude to her children for standing by her. Randall Knight was sentenced to 24 years in federal prison for crossing state lines to commit murder. The Gasper case is a haunting reminder that time does not erase guilt, and that justice, though delayed, can still arrive. What began as an unsolved stabbing in a quiet parking lot ended as a chilling parable of betrayal, greed, and the cost of silence. 21. Rita GLUZMAN. In 1971, Rita GLUZMAN was a hero, a Soviet Jewish refusenik who fought tirelessly to reunite with her husband Yakov after the Soviet regime denied his emigration. She became a public face of freedom, testifying before Congress, meeting world leaders, and securing global support. 25 years later, she made headlines again. But this time not as a symbol of justice, but as its defendant. On April 6, 1996, in the quiet town of Pearl River, New York, Yakov GLUZMAN, a renowned cancer researcher, was ambushed in his apartment and brutally murdered. Days later, his body was found dismembered, hidden inside 10 black garbage bags at the edge of the Passaic River. Caught red-handed was Vladimir Zelenin, Rita's cousin and employee. He had blood on his clothes, surgical gloves on his hands, and a hacksaw in the trunk. But it was his confession that stunned investigators. "Rita told me to do it. She planned everything." Yakov and Rita GLUZMAN had once been an inseparable pair, brilliant, ambitious, and devoted to each other. They fled oppression, built a life in the U.S., and raised a son together. Yakov became a respected scientist. Rita ran a small tech company. But beneath the surface, their marriage had decayed. Yakov wanted a divorce. He had fallen in love with another woman, and he was ready to leave. Rita, according to prosecutors, was not. Their separation was bitter. Legal battles dragged on for months. Then Rita made a fateful choice. She crossed state lines with Zelenin from New Jersey into New York. They waited in Yakov's apartment. When he arrived, they attacked. Yakov was struck repeatedly with an axe. His body was cut into over 60 pieces. The plan, according to Zelenin, was to erase him completely. Authorities lacked physical evidence. No DNA, no fingerprints. Prosecuting Rita for murder under New York law would have been nearly impossible. But federal prosecutors had a new tool, the 1994 Violence Against Women Act. It allowed them to charge Rita with crossing state lines to commit domestic violence, a federal offense carrying a life sentence when it results in death. In January 1997, a jury found her guilty. At sentencing, Judge Barrington Parker spoke directly to her. "You are a woman of considerable courage, capacity, and accomplishment. For whatever reason, you allowed yourself to disintegrate around the relationship and the pain that grew out of it. Rita GLUZMAN was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Her son Elon sat silently in the courtroom. He had already lost his father, now his mother too. Today, Rita GLUZMAN remains incarcerated, a name once etched in the annals of human rights, now remembered as the first woman convicted of murder under a law meant to protect victims of domestic abuse. None of us can ever know what transpired between you and your husband, the judge said. But nothing that occurred can possibly justify what you did. 22. Brigitte HARRIS. Brigitte HARRIS was 26 years old when she called 911 on a summer afternoon in 2007. Her voice was shaky. She reported a man in distress, her father bleeding in her apartment in Far Rockaway, Queens. What followed wasn't just a criminal case. It was a reckoning. Born in 1981 in Staten Island, Brigitte's childhood was shaped by trauma, silence, and survival. Abandoned by her mother at age 2, she was passed between relatives, some neglectful, others abusive. But the deepest wound, according to Brigitte, came from the man who should have protected her father, Eric Goodridge. She claimed that for years he molested her and her sister Carlene under the guise of cultural tradition, telling them, "This is how a father shows love." The abuse, she said, began when she was just 3 years old and continued across continents, including during visits to Liberia. By her late teens, Brigitte had broken away. She worked as a security guard, lived alone, and tried to rebuild her life. But the past was never far behind. In July 2007, her sister called with news their father was back in town. Worse, he planned to take his granddaughters, Brigitte's nieces, back to Liberia. For Brigitte, this wasn't just a family dispute. She saw it as a return to the cycle of abuse. On July 28th, Brigitte invited her father to her apartment, hoping, she said, to reason with him. But the conversation turned tense. He dismissed her claims, minimized the past, and hinted at plans that chilled her. What happened next was not impulsive. Brigitte handcuffed her father, stuffed a towel in his mouth to keep him quiet, and used a scalpel purchased online days earlier to sever his penis. She later told the court, "I didn't want to kill him. I just wanted to take away his weapon." She never fled. She called 911. She called her sister. And when paramedics arrived, it was too late. Eric Goodridge had suffocated. Brigitte checked herself into a psychiatric facility. Within weeks, she was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. But her defense wasn't simple denial, it was the story of her life. At trial, Brigitte took the stand and revealed years of alleged abuse. Her sister Carlene came forward too, finally admitting she had been abused as well. 7 of the 12 jurors were so moved, they wrote letters to the judge asking for leniency. The verdict, not murder, not revenge, but second-degree manslaughter. The judge gave her the maximum 5 to 15 years. She served 5. Brigitte HARRIS was released on parole in August 2012. Since then, she has spoken publicly about abuse, mental health, and the quiet destruction that secrecy can cause. "I don't think killing him was the answer," she said in an interview. "But I had to stop him. I couldn't let it happen again." Today, her story remains one of the most polarizing in recent memory. A woman once labeled a murderer, seen by others as a survivor who took justice into her own hands. 23. Kayla HENRIQUES. They were once close, more than friends. Kamisha Richards took Kayla HENRIQUES under her wing, cared for her child, and even planned his first birthday. But in February 2011, their friendship collapsed in a single night, over a $20 loan. Kayla HENRIQUES was just 18 years old, living in Brooklyn and raising a young son. Her life had been shaped by hardship. She'd lost her mother young and was taken in by relatives. Kamisha, 4 years older and already a college graduate with law school ambitions, became a big sister figure. But sometimes even strong bonds fray under pressure. What started as a small loan, $20 for baby supplies, turned into a public falling out. The two traded barbed Facebook posts, their disagreement spiraling from private frustration to a digital war of words for all to see. Kamisha demanded her money back. Kayla, feeling judged and cornered, lashed out. As their posts turned, increasingly bitter friends and family watched with growing concern. But few believed it would go further than online insults. Then came the night of February 28th. In the East New York apartment shared by both women and members of the Henriquez family, the tension boiled over. An argument erupted face to face, no longer through a screen. According to reports, Kamisha saw the formula in the fridge and poured some out, claiming it was half of what Kayla owed her. The confrontation escalated quickly. Kayla later confessed that in a panic she ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. Moments later, Kamisha lay dying from a single stab wound. Police arrested Kayla just hours after the incident. Witnesses pointed investigators in her direction, and Henriquez made statements implicating herself. She later described it as a mistake, an act of defense, not malice. But the damage was irreversible. Kamisha Richards, a John Jay College graduate and aspiring lawyer, was gone. Her family was left devastated, struggling to make sense of a tragedy that had unfolded in full view online, then in real life. Kayla Henriquez was charged with second-degree murder, but ultimately pleaded guilty to manslaughter. In 2013, she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. At the time of her sentencing, Henriquez was 20 years old. Her Facebook profile, still active for a brief moment after the crime, carried a final message. "I can't believe this happened. I'm sorry. I send my condolences to her family. R.I.P. Kamisha." It was a moment of remorse, one that came too late. This case became a haunting example of how fragile relationships can unravel under the weight of resentment, financial stress, and public humiliation. How social media, when used to air grievances instead of resolve them, can inflame conflict instead of cooling it. A friend, a sister figure, a young mother, a future lawyer. Two lives collided. One ended. One was forever changed. Sometimes it isn't just the loudest arguments we should fear. It's the ones that start small and don't stop in time. 24. Waneta Ethel HOYT. She was a quiet mother in a small town. To neighbors, Waneta HOYT was gentle, polite grieving. Over a span of 6 years, she lost 5 of her 6 children. The diagnoses were always the same: sudden infant death syndrome, a medical mystery, a tragedy beyond comprehension. But nearly 3 decades later, grief gave way to suspicion, and the truth proved darker than anyone imagined. Waneta Ethel HOYT was born in 1946 in rural Richford, New York. She left high school early and married Tim HOYT at just 17. By the time she was 25, she had given birth to and buried 5 of her children. First came Eric, who died at 3 months. Then Julie and James, both gone within a month of each other. Molly followed 2 years later, and Noah, the youngest, in 1971. Each death was devastating. Each ruled as SIDS, then a relatively new, poorly understood diagnosis. But even in medical circles, questions lingered. What were the odds that 5 children from the same family would all succumb to a syndrome with no known cause? In 1972, a respected pediatrician published a study based on the HOYTs proposing a link between sleep apnea and SIDS. It became a landmark in pediatric research. But one forensic pathologist, Dr. Linda Norton, saw it differently. The pattern, she believed, pointed not to medical mystery, but to murder. In 1992, a district attorney named William Fitzpatrick reopened the forgotten case. The odds didn't add up. He had the children's autopsies re-examined. The results were chilling. All 5 had been healthy. There were no signs of disease, no medical reason they should have died. Then in March 1994, police approached HOYT under the guise of researching SIDS. During a 2-hour interrogation, she broke. In a calm, detached voice, she confessed she had suffocated each child one by one. Not out of hatred, but because, as she claimed, she couldn't stand their crying. But Waneta would later recant. Her lawyers argued the confession was coerced, taken while she was mentally fragile. Experts on both sides debated her state of mind. Some believed she had personality disorders that made her unusually vulnerable to suggestion. Others speculated she may have suffered from Munchausen syndrome, by proxy a controversial diagnosis, where a caregiver harms a child to gain sympathy. Despite the controversy, a jury convicted her in April 1995. She was sentenced to 75 years to life, 15 years for each child. Waneta HOYT died in prison just 3 years later in 1998 of pancreatic cancer. Under New York law, because her appeal hadn't been heard, she was formally exonerated. But for many, the unanswered questions remain. Was she a grieving mother overwhelmed by loss, or a serial killer hiding behind a mask of mourning? The HOYT case shattered assumptions not just about SIDS, but about the limits of maternal instinct. It exposed the dangers of unexamined grief, and the haunting truth that even the most tragic stories can hide something far worse. Sometimes the most heartbreaking mysteries don't end with an answer. They begin with 25. Leisa Jones. On a summer morning in July 2010, smoke curled into the skies over Staten Island. A fire had broken out in a small second-floor apartment in Port Richmond. Inside, firefighters made a heartbreaking discovery. 5 family members were dead, 4 children, and their mother. At first, it seemed like an unspeakable accident. Then came the truth, far more haunting than anyone imagined. Leisa Jones, years old, was a single mother of 4. To many, she was quiet but devoted. She kept her children well-dressed and well-mannered. She attended beauty school, worked holiday shifts as a security guard at Macy's, and made use of local food pantries to help feed her family. Life wasn't easy, but she held it together until she couldn't. In the early hours of July 22, 2010, everything unraveled. Emergency responders arrived to find a blaze tearing through the apartment. Inside were the bodies of 14-year-old C.J. Raymond, 10-year-old Brittany, 7-year-old Melanie, and 2-year-old Jermaine. Their mother Lisa was found nearby. At first, investigators suspected C.J. citing behavioral issues and a history of fire setting. But that theory collapsed quickly. The autopsy revealed that the 3 older children had died before the fire. Their lungs showed no signs of smoke inhalation. The youngest, Jermaine, and Leisa herself had died in the fire, meaning they were alive when it started. Then detectives found a scorched piece of paper near Lisa's body. On it, 2 words, "I'm sorry." A forensic analysis confirmed the handwriting was hers. It became clear this was a murder-suicide. Investigators concluded that Leisa had taken the lives of her children before setting the apartment ablaze. She died in the fire with her youngest son in her arms. But why psychologists point to a disturbing pattern seen in certain cases of maternal filicide, when a parent gripped by extreme despair or distorted thinking believes death is preferable to what they fear awaits their children. Dr. Donna Cohen, an expert in murder-suicides, explained it this way. In her mind, this may have been love. She likely saw herself as the only one who could protect them from poverty, instability, or a world she believed was closing in. Lisa's background helps form a picture, one of deep emotional and financial strain. She'd been evicted, struggled to pay rent, and at one point was reportedly homeless in Washington, D.C. She kept much of this from her family, maintaining an image of control. But behind closed doors, the weight was crushing. Her eldest son, CJ, had also shown signs of distress, behavioral challenges at school, and increasing volatility. Some believe Lisa feared losing him to the system, or worse. There's no definitive answer. In the wake of the tragedy, the neighborhood mourned. Stuffed animals, balloons, and handwritten notes lined the sidewalk in front of the burned home. A community grieved not just the loss of 5 lives, but the sense that no one saw it coming. This case doesn't offer a satisfying resolution. There is no trial, no surviving perpetrator, to question, no answers that erase the pain. Only a chilling reminder: despair can hide in plain sight. If there's one lesson in this tragedy, it's this: even those who seem strong may be holding on by a thread. 26. Elena KIEJLICHES. Elena KIEJLICHES was living the American dream on paper. A glamorous Russian émigré with a millionaire husband, 2 children, and a mansion in Staten Island's exclusive Taut Hill. Her life looked perfect. But behind the gates and marble floors, something was unraveling. In March 2000, Elena's husband, Boris KIEJLICHES, a wealthy jet fuel entrepreneur, vanished without a trace. His Mercedes was later found abandoned near Brighton Beach. No one knew where he'd gone. And his wife, she was on vacation in Disney World with their children. Then a month later, a gruesome discovery shifted everything. A sealed barrel drifted into a marsh along the Brooklyn-Queens border. Inside was the decomposing body of Boris KIEJLICHES, shot once in the head and bound in towels. At first, suspicion pointed outward. Boris had business ties abroad. Perhaps Russian rivals had finally caught up to him. But detectives found no trail leading overseas. Instead, their focus turned inward, to the house on East Loop Road. That's when the name Messiah Justice entered the investigation. Justice was a Brooklyn ex-convict and aspiring rapper. Charismatic and streetwise, he had quickly become Elena's lover, and prosecutors said her accomplice. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he agreed to testify. According to Justice, Elena shot her husband in the basement while their children slept upstairs. She called him shortly after, hands still stained. Together, they wrapped the body, removed part of the carpet, and loaded it into a barrel. The next day, Elena boarded a plane to Orlando with her kids. To some, it was a cold calculation. To others, it was too bizarre to believe. At trial, Elena painted a different picture. She claimed Justice had committed the murder and manipulated the entire narrative to save himself. Her defense pointed to his lengthy criminal record and claimed he was a con man seeking immunity. But jurors weren't convinced. After just 3 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder and evidence tampering. Elena KIEJLICHES was sentenced to 22 years to life in prison. Messiah Justice received a drastically lighter sentence, just 1 to 3 years, for his role in disposing of the body. Elena has maintained her innocence ever since. She's filed multiple appeals, including a federal habeas petition, all of which have been denied. In 2024, she becomes eligible for parole. The legacy of this case lies not just in the crime, but in the contradictions it revealed. Was Elena a calculating killer chasing freedom and fortune, or a woman caught in the gravitational pull of a dangerous affair? The evidence was circumstantial, the motive emotional, the truth. It may live somewhere in between. Boris KIEJLICHES trusted the person closest to him. That trust, whether broken by betrayal or blurred by chaos, ended in a barrel in a marsh far from the life he built. And as the years pass, one question still lingers: did Elena KIEJLICHES act out of desperation or design? 27. Sante KIMES. Sante KIMES was born Sandra Louise Walker in 1934, but over time she would become known by many names and wear many masks: grifter, impersonator, slaveholder, murderer. By the end of her criminal career, Kimes had racked up convictions for theft, fraud, slavery, and 2 murders with her son Kenneth as her partner in crime. Their twisted bond shocked even seasoned prosecutors. Kimes's life began in Oklahoma City. From an early age, she gravitated toward manipulation. She didn't just steal for money, she stole for control. A master of illusion, she once impersonated Elizabeth Taylor, claimed to be royalty, and even talked her way into White House receptions. But behind the glamour and lies was a deep need for dominance. Her early scams were almost always bold: insurance fraud, real estate schemes, and perhaps most chilling, enslaving undocumented workers in her home, threatening them with deportation if they didn't comply. In 1985, she was convicted of violating federal anti-slavery laws and sentenced to 5 years in prison. But when she emerged in 1989, she was more dangerous than ever. By then, her son Kenneth had become her closest confidant and accomplice. Their first known murder was in 1998. David Kasdan, a former business associate, had threatened to expose a forged loan Sante had taken out in his name. When he refused to stay silent, Kenneth shot him in the back of the head and dumped his body in a dumpster near the Los Angeles airport. Months later, they moved on to Irene Silverman, a wealthy 82-year-old New York socialite who owned a $7.7 million mansion in Manhattan. The Kimeses rented a suite under false identities and began plotting. Their goal: steal her identity, forge property documents, and take her home. On July 5, 1998, Irene Silverman vanished. Her body was never found. But when police searched Sante and Kenneth's car, they discovered a trove of evidence: forged deeds, surveillance notes, Silverman's keys and ID weapons wigs, and Sante's own notebooks detailing the plan to take Irene's identity. Both were arrested and charged. During the trial, Kenneth confessed to killing Irene after Sante used a stun gun on her. The jury didn't need a body to convict. They found both guilty of murder along with 117 other charges. Then came the California case, David Kasdan's murder. In 2004, facing the death penalty, Kenneth struck a plea deal. He would plead guilty and testify against his mother in exchange for sparing her life. In court, he called her a master manipulator. He also confessed to a third murder: Syed Bilal Ahmed, a banker in the Bahamas. Drugged, drowned, and dumped in the ocean. Again, no body was found. During sentencing, the judge called Sante Kimes one of the most evil individuals they had ever seen. Kenneth received life. Sante, already sentenced to over 120 years in New York, received another life term. She died in prison in 2014, still proclaiming her innocence. Sante Kimes left behind no empire, only a legacy of deception, control, and ruin. In the end, her greatest con was convincing her own son to follow her into darkness. "Control is better than money," she once said. It was the truth and her curse. 28. Elizabeth Lloyd King. In the spring of 1873, a shocking murder shook Brooklyn's quiet brownstone neighborhoods and captivated the attention of the entire city. Charles Goodrich, a well-known businessman and Civil War veteran, was found dead in his home. A respected man with no known enemies, yet he had been shot 3 times in the head. At first, rumors swirled: had he taken his own life? Was it a robbery gone wrong, or was there a more intimate secret buried beneath the surface? The answer came with the name Kate Stoddard, or as history would come to know her, Lizzie Lloyd King. Elizabeth Lloyd King was born in 1847 in Plymouth, Massachusetts. By all early accounts, she was intelligent, articulate, and musically gifted. But as she grew older, something in her demeanor began to shift. Her behavior became erratic. In her early 20s, she was committed to the Taunton Lunatic Asylum, diagnosed with what was then called mania. After her release, she resurfaced in New York City under an alias. By 1872, she was calling herself Kate Stoddard and working as a bonnet maker. It was during this time she met Charles Goodrich after replying to a personal ad in a local paper. Their relationship quickly intensified. Lizzie claimed they married in a private ceremony, but no legal record of their union existed. Goodrich soon tried to distance himself, offering her a place to stay and some financial support, but urging her to never again refer to herself as his wife. She refused. By early 1873, Lizzie was living in one of Goodrich's brownstones on Degraw Street in Brooklyn. But when he asked her to leave, the situation escalated. On March 20th, during a final argument in the basement, Lizzie shot him 3 times. She cleaned the scene and vanished. For months, the police chased leads searching for a mysterious woman who had been living with Goodrich under a false name. Detectives found letters signed Amy G. and a book of poems bearing the name Kate Stoddard. Public interest exploded. The city offered a $500 reward. Still no arrest. Then came a twist worthy of fiction. Mary Handley, Lizzie's former roommate, was deputized as a detective. On July 8th, she spotted Lizzie by chance on a ferry and notified police. Lizzie was arrested and later confessed. At her inquest, courtroom galleries were filled with curious onlookers. She showed no remorse. When asked about the blood found in a locket around her neck, she calmly replied, "That's dried blood." Declared mentally unfit for trial, Lizzie Lloyd King was committed to the State Lunatic Asylum in Auburn, New York in 1874. She would remain there for the rest of her life. She continued writing letters, some sewn together from cut-out Bible verses, and petitioned for better treatment, even arguing against the legality of her indefinite confinement. To this day, she remains one of the most enigmatic figures in 19th-century American crime. A woman of charm and intelligence whose desire for love or perhaps control ended in death. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't a stranger. She was the woman he once called "my dearest Amy," and in the end, she would be known only as the Goodrich murderess. 29. Awilda Lopez. In the shadows of New York City's Lower East Side, behind the concrete walls of public housing, a tragedy unfolded so quietly, yet so catastrophically it would haunt a nation and expose the cracks in a system meant to protect its most vulnerable. This is the story of Awilda Lopez and her 6-year-old daughter, Elisa Izquierdo. Awilda Lopez was born in 1966 and raised in Brooklyn. Her early life was marked by instability, addiction, and cycles of violence. She struggled with substance abuse as an adult, particularly crack cocaine, and was known to social services long before Elisa's birth. Elisa entered the world in 1989, already fighting for survival. Born addicted to drugs, she was placed in the custody of her father, Gustavo Izquierdo, a Cuban immigrant and shelter worker, who quickly became her entire world. By all accounts, Gustavo was a devoted father. He dressed Elisa in clean clothes, braided her hair with care, and enrolled her in a Montessori preschool, where she shone with joy and curiosity. She caught the attention of Prince Michael of Greece, a school benefactor, who promised to fund her education through college. For a time, Elisa's life was filled with love and possibility. But after Gustavo's death from cancer in 1994, everything changed. Despite opposition from family, teachers, and even the prince himself, the court granted full custody of Elisa to her biological mother, Awilda. Almost immediately, Elisa's bright light began to dim. Reports of neglect and suspected abuse surfaced quickly. School officials and concerned neighbors tried to intervene, but each time warnings were lost in bureaucracy or dismissed as inconclusive. The system failed to connect the dots or act in time. In the months that followed, Elisa was withdrawn from school, isolated from her siblings, and rarely seen outside. Multiple reports to child welfare services went unheeded. A child once described as radiant and full of life was disappearing before everyone's eyes. Then, on November 22, 1995, the day before Thanksgiving, Elisa Izquierdo was found dead inside her mother's apartment. Awilda Lopez was arrested the next day. The evidence and her confession left little doubt about her responsibility. In 1996, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The court called her actions monstrous, but it also placed blame on a broken child welfare system that had failed to respond to repeated cries for help. Lopez remains incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York. As of her most recent parole hearings, she has been denied release multiple times. But Elisa's story didn't end there. The public outcry over her death prompted sweeping reform. In 1996, Governor George Pataki signed Elisa's law increasing transparency and accountability within Child Protective Services. The Administration for Children's Services was established, and juvenile court proceedings began opening to the public. Elisa Izquierdo, once described by her teachers as having an enchanted aura, became more than a tragic figure. She became a symbol, a call to action, a reminder that silence and indifference can be just as dangerous as violence itself. There is no keener revelation of a society's soul, Nelson Mandela once said, than the way in which it treats its children. And perhaps no case reveals that more painfully than the life and death of Elisa Izquierdo. 30. Narcy NOVACK. At first glance, Narcy NOVACK lived the American dream, a millionaire's wife surrounded by wealth, luxury, and prestige. But beneath the polished exterior was a chilling truth, one that would unravel in a murder plot spanning 2 states, 2 victims, and 1 motive: greed. Narcy NOVACK was born Narcisa Veliz in Ecuador in 1947. She came to the United States and eventually found work as a stripper in Florida. That's where she met Ben Novak Jr., heir to the Fontainebleau hotel empire, a man born into wealth, fame, and eccentricity. Their relationship was stormy, but they married, blending opulence with instability. For 20 years, Narcy and Ben were a curious match, he a Batman memorabilia collector and business mogul, she a fiery woman with a temper. But as their marriage faltered and Ben pursued an affair with a former adult actress, Narcy saw her lavish lifestyle and her grip on the Novak fortune slipping away. With a prenuptial agreement limiting her inheritance to just $65,000, divorce meant the end of everything. So Narcy decided if she couldn't have it all, no one would. In April of 2009, Ben's 87-year-old mother, Bernice Novak, was found dead in her Fort Lauderdale home. It was ruled an accident, an elderly woman's fall. But just 3 months later, the unthinkable happened. Ben himself was murdered inside a Hilton hotel room in Rye Brook, New York. Bound and beaten, Ben Novak Jr. was the second family member to die under suspiciously similar circumstances. It wasn't long before investigators began to connect the dots. What started as 2 isolated tragedies soon revealed a calculated conspiracy. At the center of it all, Narcy Novak and her brother, Cristobal Veliz. Prosecutors alleged that Narcy had orchestrated both murders, enlisting her brother to hire hitmen. Witnesses testified that she had let the killers into the hotel room herself, and even stayed to ensure the job was done. Her motive, a multi-million-dollar inheritance and revenge on a husband she believed was about to leave her. The FBI followed a trail of phone records, surveillance footage, and bank transactions that led directly back to Narcy and Veliz. The killers, who were paid in cash, eventually testified against them in exchange for lighter sentences. In June 2012, Narcy Novak and her brother were convicted on multiple counts. including conspiracy, money laundering, stalking, and witness tampering. Though they were acquitted of felony murder, the charges carried life sentences. Narcy, ever defiant, waived her right to attend the sentencing. The judge called it a final act of cowardice. Her brother sat in silence, blaming Narcy's daughter for the crime, a claim the court found baseless. Today, Narcy NOVACK remains behind bars, serving life without parole. She forfeited all rights to the NOVACK estate under Florida's Slayer statute. The fortune she once schemed to claim is now out of reach, likely to pass to her grandsons. From riches to a prison cell, Narcy NOVACK's story is a cautionary tale of how greed can rot even the most glamorous facade, and of how, in the end, no amount of wealth is worth a soul sold for power. 31. Diane ODELL. In 2003, a man in Arizona opened a storage unit he'd purchased at auction. He expected to find old furniture or forgotten tools. What he uncovered instead was a secret buried for decades. 3 small boxes, 3 infants, 1 woman. This is the haunting case of Diane ODELL, dubbed by the media as the mother in the Babies in Boxes murder trial. Born in 1953, Diane ODELL lived most of her life in upstate New York. Outwardly, she appeared to be a mother of 8, a quiet woman leading an unassuming life. But behind closed doors, ODELL carried with her a past she never intended the world to see. In May 2003, police traced the contents of a storage shed in Safford, Arizona, back to ODELL. Inside were the mummified remains of 3 infants, each wrapped in blankets, hidden inside stained cardboard boxes. The grim discovery led investigators down a cold, decades-old trail spanning back to the early 1980s. The infants were born in 1982, 1983, and 1985, all in Kaneonga Lake, New York. ODELL admitted to concealing their births and deaths, but insisted each child had died naturally. Prosecutors disagreed. The forensic evidence told a darker story. Though too decomposed to determine exact causes of death, the condition of the remains suggested traumatic asphyxia. Prosecutors argued that the babies had been smothered shortly after birth. Victims not of nature, but of intent. And there was more. 14 years earlier, in 1989, the body of another infant, ODELL's first child, born in 1972, was found in a suitcase in a junked car. That case never led to charges. But this time, investigators believed they had enough to pursue justice. Diane ODELL was arrested and charged with 3 counts of second-degree murder. Her trial began in late 2003. The defense portrayed her as a victim of lifelong abuse, a woman who feared her domineering mother more than the law. They claimed the deaths were accidents, tragic, but not criminal. The jury saw it differently. In December 2003, ODELL was convicted on all 3 counts of depraved indifference murder. The judge called her actions a dark tale of disregard for the sanctity of life. In January 2004, she was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. ODELL maintained her innocence at sentencing, saying, "I have been in a jail of my own making for most of my life. I want to know, when does my suffering end?" But the court and the public saw her not as a prisoner of circumstance, but as the architect of a tragedy. She is currently incarcerated in New York State and will be eligible for parole in 2029. The remains of the children she kept hidden for so long have since been returned to her family for proper burial. Whether out of guilt, grief, or fear, ODELL carried them with her for over a decade, silent witnesses to a story no one was meant to discover. In a case shrouded in secrecy, one thing remains clear: sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and when it surfaces, it demands to be heard. 32. Yoselyn ORTEGA. In the heart of New York City's Upper West Side, nestled among tree-lined avenues and pre-war buildings, lived a picture-perfect family. Marina and Kevin Krim had built a life centered around love art and their 3 young children. But on October 25, 2012, that life would be shattered. And at the center of it all was someone they trusted like family. Her name was Yoselyn Ortega. 50 years old, born in the Dominican Republic. Ortega was a naturalized U.S. citizen and longtime nanny. By all accounts, she was quiet, reserved, even distant. She'd worked with the Krims for 2 years, cared for their children, vacationed with the family, and had even introduced them to her relatives abroad. But behind her composed exterior, Ortega was unraveling. Friends and neighbors had begun to notice subtle shifts. She looked gaunt, distracted. She'd lost her Bronx apartment and moved back in with her sister. She spoke of financial stress, selling jewelry and makeup for extra income, and in quiet conversations, she hinted at a growing resentment toward work, toward life, and most tragically, toward the very family she was helping raise. On that October afternoon, Marina Krim took her middle child Nessie to a swim lesson. Her 2 other children, 6-year-old Lulu and 2-year-old Leo, stayed behind with Ortega. When the nanny failed to meet her as planned afterward, Marina returned home. The apartment was dark, too quiet. She searched room by room until she opened the bathroom door. There she found her children, and Ortega silently turning the knife on herself. Ortega survived. She was taken to the hospital in critical condition. As she recovered, police began piecing together what had led to that unimaginable scene. She spoke hesitantly, resentfully. She said the family asked too much of her, that they made her clean, that she felt disrespected, though those close to the Krims described nothing but kindness. The family had even paid for Ortega to visit her own relatives on vacation. Later it would come out, the Krims had recently confronted Ortega about her performance. They offered extra hours to help with her money troubles, hoping to ease her burden. But to Ortega, it was a final insult. She never explicitly confessed. But when asked about the children, she reportedly whispered, "Marina knows what happened." In November 2012, Ortega was indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. At her arraignment, she lay in a hospital bed, frail, silent, her throat bandaged from the wounds she'd inflicted on herself. The trial would take years to begin. When it did in 2018, Ortega's defense hinged on mental illness. But jurors saw something else, not a psychotic break, but a calculated act of rage. She was found guilty on all counts. Sentenced to life in prison without parole, Ortega now resides in a New York State correctional facility. For the Krims, the loss was and is immeasurable. But through grief, they created Light, the Lulu and Leo Fund, supporting children's art programs and resilience. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, love endures. Because trust once broken can leave scars that never fade. And sometimes, the greatest danger lies closest to home. 33. Martha M. Place. In an era when women were rarely seen as capable of the worst crimes, one name forced the public and the justice system to reconsider. Her name was Martha M. Place, and in 1899, she became the first woman in American history to be executed in the electric chair. Martha Gerritsen was born in New Jersey in 1854. Her early life was ordinary, but an accident at age 23 would mark a turning point. She was struck in the head by a sleigh, and according to her brother, she was never quite the same. The trauma, he claimed, left her mentally unstable, moody, and increasingly unpredictable. In 1893, Martha married a widower named William Place. He had a teenage daughter, Ida, from his first marriage. The union wasn't built on love. William needed help raising Ida, and Martha may have seen the marriage as a new beginning. But behind closed doors, tensions grew. Reports would later suggest that Martha was jealous of Ida, of her youth, her relationship with her father, and perhaps of the life Martha felt she was never given. On February 7, 1899, the simmering tension exploded. William returned home to their Brooklyn apartment that evening and was met by Martha armed with an axe. He was attacked, suffering a fractured skull, but managed to flee for help. When police entered the home, they made a chilling discovery. 17-year-old Ida was found dead in her bedroom. Though early reports included lurid details, the official cause was suffocation. The circumstances pointed squarely at Martha. She was found unconscious upstairs, having opened the gas lines in what appeared to be a failed suicide attempt. She survived and was arrested the same day. Martha claimed innocence. She admitted to throwing acid in Ida's face but denied taking her life. Her trial began quickly, and the case drew national attention not just for the crime but for its key witnesses. William, her own husband, testified against her. The jury deliberated just hours before finding her guilty of murder. She was sentenced to death by electrocution. No woman had ever been executed in this way. When Sing Sing prison prepared for her death, there was confusion. How should the electrodes be placed on a woman's body? In a grim first, they cut open her dress and attached one lead to her ankle. Edwin Davis. New York's state executioner pulled the switch. She died instantly. Governor Theodore Roosevelt had been urged to commute the sentence. He refused, calling mercy in this case mawkish sentimentality. Martha M. Place was executed on March 20, 1899. She was 44 years old. Her remains were buried quietly in her family plot in East Millstone, New Jersey, without religious ceremony. Today, her case is remembered not just for the brutality of the crime, but for the precedent it set. A line had been crossed. The electric chair, once reserved for the most violent men, had now claimed a woman. In the end, Martha's legacy isn't one of infamy or injustice. It's a chilling reminder, even in the most domestic of settings, jealousy and resentment can take on a life of their own. And when history remembers a name, it doesn't always remember it kindly. 34. Cynthia PUGH. February 24, 1983. In the quiet town of Fayetteville, New York, a man fails to show up for work. Hours later, he's found dead in his bed, shot once in the head. The victim, 58-year-old James Pipines, a respected contractor and co-owner of Central City Roofing. The prime suspect, Cynthia PUGH, his longtime employee, and as it later emerged, his lover. Cynthia was no stranger to hardship. A mother of 6, she worked her way up in the company managing accounts and payroll. On paper, she was loyal and efficient. But prosecutors would argue otherwise, alleging embezzlement, jealousy, and a motive to kill. The morning James was killed, Cynthia claimed she couldn't reach him. She said she went to check on him and found his body. Calmly, she called his business partner, then the police. But her version of events unraveled fast. Detectives were troubled by inconsistencies. Cynthia said she didn't see James's car in the driveway, yet photos showed it parked clearly in view. She claimed she touched his body, and it was still warm, yet the coroner placed time of death hours earlier. And when the murder weapon, a .38 Derringer, was found weeks later near a payphone, Cynthia had used ballistics, linked it directly to the bullet that ended James's life. That gun was registered to Cynthia's common-law husband. Police questioned her for hours. At first, she denied the affair. Later, she admitted it, but maintained her innocence. She offered alternative theories. Maybe it was a professional hit, maybe James had enemies. She pointed to witnesses who'd seen a mysterious car leaving his home. But prosecutors weren't convinced. They argued that Cynthia killed James after learning he planned to fire her and possibly end their relationship. Her motive, they said, was both personal and financial. She faced public humiliation and the loss of her income, so she made sure neither would happen. Cynthia went on trial twice. The first jury couldn't agree. The second found her guilty of second-degree murder. After 50 hours of deliberation, the verdict was read, and Cynthia collapsed in court. She was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. But she never wavered in her denial. For over 2 decades, Cynthia PUGH insisted she was innocent. Her case drew letters of support, editorials, and even sympathy from some former jurors. She filed appeals and challenged the parole board. At one point, she was granted release only to have it rescinded days later after public outcry from the victim's family. Finally, in 2008, after serving 24 years behind bars, Cynthia walked free. She was 69 years old. To this day, the question lingers, was she a cold-blooded killer, or the victim of circumstantial justice? Justice often comes in shades of gray. In the court of law, evidence speaks, but in the court of public opinion, doubt never quite fades. 35. Janet Redmond-MERCEREAU. On December 2, 2007, the stillness of a Sunday morning was shattered in Oakwood, Staten Island. Inside that home, supervising Fire Marshal Douglas MERCEREAU was found dead, in his bed shot with his own service weapon. The only other adult in the house, his wife Janet Redmond-MERCEREAU. What followed would become one of the most closely watched murder trials in Staten Island's recent history. A story of resentment, silence, and suspicion hidden behind the walls of a seemingly ordinary home. Janet Redmond-MERCEREAU was a high school English teacher, a Staten Island native, and mother of 2. Born in 1969, she lived what looked like a conventional life. But prosecutors painted a very different picture, a woman simmering with years of bitterness and emotional isolation. They described her as a volcano, someone who'd endured relentless criticism about her housekeeping, her weight, and her marriage, until one day they claimed she erupted. On the morning of the murder, Redmond-MERCEREAU called 911, reporting that she had just discovered her husband's body. She told officers she had slept in her daughter's room, sedated by prescription medication, and unaware of anything unusual during the night. But the evidence raised questions. She knew exactly how many times her husband had been shot, details police hadn't yet released. There were no signs of forced entry. And she admitted to taking multiple showers and washing her clothes shortly after the killing actions investigators believed were meant to remove gunpowder residue. Still, there were no fingerprints on the weapon, no eyewitnesses, and no direct forensic proof linking her to the crime. The case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. But it was her behavior in the days after the murder that caught public attention and earned her an unsettling nickname, the Merry Widow. She posed for photographers with a smile. She joked that she felt like a model. Just weeks after the funeral, she chopped down her husband's favorite tree. To many, it didn't look like grief, it looked like indifference. Redmond-MERCEREAU maintained her innocence, even going on national television to proclaim it. Her attorneys argued that she was being vilified for how she looked and acted, not for what she had done. The jury saw it differently. After days of deadlock, they returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. In July 2009, Janet Redmond-MERCEREAU was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Today, she resides at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in Westchester County. She will be eligible for parole in 2033. Her daughters, who were 5 and 6 years old at the time of the murder, were placed in the care of their uncle. They are now young adults raised far from the home where their father's life was cut short. One former neighbor once said, "I still find it hard to believe she pulled the trigger. I can't imagine what kind of torment would drive someone to do that." Perhaps we'll never know the full truth of what happened that morning. But for those who knew Douglas MERCEREAU, what remains is this: a dedicated father, a respected fire marshal, and a life ended far too soon.